This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 17. A Double Victory. Norman Douglas came to church the first Sunday in November, and made all the sensation he desired. Mr. Meredith shook hands with him absently on the church steps, and hoped dreamily that Mrs. Douglas was well. "She wasn't very well just before I buried her 10 years ago, but I reckon she has better health now," boomed Norman, to the horror and amusement of everyone except Mr. Meredith, who was absorbed in wondering if he had made the last head of his sermon as clear as he might have, and hadn't the least idea what Norman had said to him, or he to Norman. Norman intercepted Faith at the gate. "Kept my word, you see, kept my word, Red Rose. I'm free now till the first Sunday in December. Fine sermon, girl, fine sermon. Your father has more on his head than he carries on his face. But he contradicted himself once. Tell him he contradicted himself. And tell him I want that brimstone sermon in December. Great way to wind up the old year, with a taste of hell, you know. And what's the matter with a nice tasty discourse on heaven for New Year's? Though it wouldn't be half as interesting as hell, girl, not half. Only I'd like to know what your father thinks about heaven. He can think. Rarest thing in the world, a person who can think. But he did contradict himself. Ha ha! Here's a question you might ask him sometimes when he's awake, girl. Can God make a stone so big he couldn't lift it himself? Don't forget now. I want to hear his opinion of it. I've stumped many a minister with that, girl." Faith was glad to escape him and run home. Dan Reese, standing among the crowd of boys at the gate, looked at her and shaped his mouth into "pig girl," but dared not utter it aloud just there. Next day in school was a different matter. At noon recess, Faith encountered Dan in the little spruce plantation behind the school, and Dan shouted once more, "Pig girl, rooster girl!" Walter Blythe suddenly rose from a mossy cushion behind a little clump of firs where he had been reading. He was very pale, but his eyes blazed. "You hold your tongue, Dan Reese," he said. "Oh, hello, Miss Walter," retorted Dan, not at all abashed. He vaulted airily to the top of the rail fence and chanted insultingly, "Cowardy, cowardy custard, stole a pot of mustard, cowardy, cowardy custard." "You are a coincidence," said Walter scornfully, turning still whiter. He had only a very hazy idea what a coincidence was, but Dan had none at all, and thought it must be something peculiarly opprobrious. "Yeah, cowardy," he yelled again. "Your mother writes lies, lies, lies. And Faith Meredith is a pig girl, a pig girl, a pig girl. And she's a rooster girl, a rooster girl, a rooster girl. Yeah, cowardy, cowardy Dan got no further. Walter had hurled himself across the intervening space and knocked Dan off the fence backward with one well-directed blow. Dan's sudden inglorious sprawl was greeted with a burst of laughter and a clapping of hands from Faith. Dan sprang up, purple with rage, and began to climb the fence. But just then the school bell rang, and Dan knew what happened to boys who were late during Mr. Hazard's regime. "We'll fight this out," he howled. "Cowardy!" "Any time you like," said Walter. "Oh, no, no, Walter," protested Faith. "Don't fight him. I don't mind what he says. I wouldn't condescend to mind the like of him." "He insulted you, and he insulted my mother," said Walter with the same deadly calm. "Tonight after school, Dan." "I've got to go right home from school to pick taters after the harrows, Dad says," Dan answered sulkily. "But tomorrow night'll do." "All right. Here, tomorrow night," agreed Walter. "And I'll smash your sissy face for you," promised Dan. Walter shuddered, not so much from fear of the threat as from repulsion over the ugliness and vulgarity of it. But he held his head high and marched into school. Faith followed in a conflict of emotions. She hated to think of Walter fighting that little sneak. But oh, he had been splendid! And he was going to fight for her, Faith Meredith, to punish her insulter. Of course he would win. Such eyes spelled victory. Faith's confidence in her champion had dimmed a little by evening, however. Walter had seemed so very quiet and dull the rest of the day in school. "If it were only Jem," she sighed to Una as they sat on Hezekiah Pollock's tombstone in the graveyard. "He is such a fighter. He could finish Dan off in no time. But Walter doesn't know much about fighting." "I'm so afraid he'll be hurt," sighed Una, who hated fighting and couldn't understand the subtle, secret exultation she divined in Faith. "He oughtn't to be," said Faith uncomfortably. "He's every bit as big as Dan." "But Dan's so much older," said Una. "Why, he's nearly a year older." "Dan hasn't done much fighting when you come to count up," said Faith. "I believe he's really a coward. He didn't think Walter would fight, or he wouldn't have called names before him. Oh, if you could have seen Walter's face when he looked at him, Una! It made me shiver, with a nice shiver. He looked just like Sir Galahad in that poem Father read us on Saturday." "I hate the thought of them fighting, and I wish it could be stopped," said Una. "Oh, it's got to go on now," cried Faith. "It's a matter of honor. Don't you dare tell anyone, Una. If you do, I'll never tell you secrets again." "I won't tell," agreed Una. "But I won't stay tomorrow to watch the fight. I'm coming right home." "Oh, all right. I have to be there. It would be mean not to, when Walter is fighting for me. I'm going to tie my colours on his arm. That's the thing to do when he's my knight. How lucky Mrs. Blythe gave me that pretty blue hair ribbon for my birthday. I've only worn it twice, so it will be almost new. But I wish I was sure Walter would win. It will be so humiliating if he doesn't." Faith would have been yet more dubious if she could have seen her champion just then. Walter had gone home from school with all his righteous anger at a low ebb, and a very nasty feeling in its place. He had to fight Dan Reese the next night, and he didn't want to. He hated the thought of it, and he kept thinking of it all the time. Not for a minute could he get away from the thought. Would it hurt much? He was terribly afraid that it would hurt. And would he be defeated and shamed? He could not eat any supper worth speaking of. Susan had made a big batch of his favourite monkey faces, but he could choke only one down. Jem ate 4. Walter wondered how he could. How could anybody eat? And how could they all talk gaily as they were doing? There was Mother, with her shining eyes and pink cheeks. She didn't know her son had to fight next day. Would she be so gay if she knew? Walter wondered darkly. Jem had taken Susan's picture with his new camera, and the result was passed around the table, and Susan was terribly indignant over it. "I am no beauty, Mrs. Dr. dear, and well I know it, but have always known it," she said in an aggrieved tone. "But that I am as ugly as that picture makes me out, I will never, no never, believe." Jem laughed over this, and Anne laughed again with him. Walter couldn't endure it. He got up and fled to his room. "That child has got something on his mind, Mrs. Dr. dear," said Susan. "He is at next to nothing. Do you suppose he's plotting another poem?" Poor Walter was very far removed in spirit from the starry realms of poesy just then. He propped his elbow on his open window-sill, and leaned his head drearily on his hands. "Come on down to the shore, Walter," cried Jem, bursting in. "The boys are going to burn the Sand Hill grass tonight. Father says we can go. Come on." At any other time Walter would have been delighted. He gloried in the burning of the Sand Hill grass. But now he flatly refused to go, and no arguments or entreaties could move him. Disappointed Jem, who did not care for the long dark walk to Four Winds Point alone, retreated to his museum in the garret, and buried himself in a book. He soon forgot his disappointment, revelling with the heroes of old romance, and pausing occasionally to picture himself a famous general leading his troops to victory on some great battlefield. Walter sat at the window until bedtime. Di crept in, hoping to be told what was wrong, but Walter could not talk of it, even to Di. Talking of it seemed to give it a reality from which he shrank. It was torture enough to think of it. The crisp, withered leaves rustled on the maple trees outside his window. The glow of rose and flame had died out of the hollow, silvery sky, and the full moon was rising gloriously over Rainbow Valley. Afar off, a ruddy wood fire was painting a page of glory on the horizon behind the hills. It was a sharp, clear evening when far-away sounds were heard distinctly. A fox was barking across the pond, an engine was puffing down at the Glen station, a blue jay was screaming madly in the maple grove. There was laughter over on the manse lawn. How could people laugh? How could foxes and blue jays and engines behave as if nothing were going to happen on the morrow? "Oh, I wish it was over," groaned Walter. He slept very little that night, and had hard work choking down his porridge in the morning. Susan was rather lavish in her platefuls. Mr. Hazard found him an unsatisfactory pupil that day. Faith Meredith's wits seemed to be wool-gathering too. Dan Reese kept drawing surreptitious pictures of girls with pig or rooster heads on his slate, and holding them up for all to see. The news of the coming battle had leaked out, and most of the boys and many of the girls were in the spruce plantation when Dan and Walter sought it after school. Una had gone home, but Faith was there, having tied her blue ribbon around Walter's arm. Walter was thankful that neither Jem nor Di nor Nan were among the crowd of spectators. Somehow they had not heard of what was in the wind, and had gone home too. Walter faced Dan quite undauntedly now. At the last moment all his fear had vanished, but he still felt disgust at the idea of fighting. Dan, it was noted, was really paler under his freckles than Walter was. One of the older boys gave the word, and Dan struck Walter in the face. Walter reeled a little. The pain of the blow tingled through all his sensitive frame for a moment. Then he felt pain no longer. Something, such as he had never experienced before, seemed to roll over him like a flood. His face flushed crimson, his eyes burned like flame. The scholars of Glen St. Mary's School had never dreamed that Miss Walter could look like that. He hurled himself forward, and closed with Dan like a young wildcat. There were no particular rules in the fights of the Glen schoolboys. It was catch as catch can, and get your blows in anyhow. Walter fought with a savage fury, and a joy in the struggle against which Dan could not hold his ground. It was all over very speedily. Walter had no clear consciousness of what he was doing, until suddenly the red mist cleared from his sight, and he found himself kneeling on the body of the prostrate Dan, whose nose, oh horror, was spouting blood. "Have you had enough?" demanded Walter through his clenched teeth. Dan sulkily admitted that he had. "My mother doesn't write lies?" "No." "Faith Meredith isn't a pig girl?" "No." "Nor a rooster girl?" "No." "And I'm not a coward?" "No." Walter had intended to ask, "And are you a liar?" But pity intervened, and he did not humiliate Dan further. Besides, that blood was so horrible. "You can go, then," he said contemptuously. There was a loud clapping from the boys, who were perched on a rail fence, but some of the girls were crying. They were frightened. They had seen schoolboy fights before, but nothing like Walter as he had grappled with Dan. There had been something terrifying about him. They thought he would kill Dan. Now that all was over, they sobbed hysterically, except Faith, who still stood tense and crimson-cheeked. Walter did not stay for any conqueror's meed. He sprang over the fence and rushed down the spruce hill to Rainbow Valley. He felt none of the victor's joy, but he felt a certain calm satisfaction in duty done and honor avenged, mingled with a sickish qualm when he thought of Dan's gory nose. It had been so ugly, and Walter hated ugliness. Also, he began to realize that he himself was somewhat sore and battered up. His lip was cut and swollen, and one eye felt very strange. In Rainbow Valley he encountered Mr. Meredith, who was coming home from an afternoon call on the Miss Wests. That reverend gentleman looked gravely at him. "It seems to me that you have been fighting, Walter." "Yes, sir," said Walter, expecting a scolding. "What was it about?" "Dan Reese said my mother wrote lies, and that Faith was a pig girl," answered Walter bluntly. "Oh, then you were certainly justified, Walter." "Do you think it's right to fight, sir?" asked Walter curiously. "Not always, and not often, but sometimes, yes, sometimes," said John Meredith. "When womankind are insulted, for instance, as in your case, my motto, Walter, is don't fight till you're sure you ought to, and then put every ounce of you into it. In spite of sundry discolorations, I infer that you came off best." "Yes, I made him take it all back." Very good indeed. I didn't think you were such a fighter, Walter." "I never fought before, and I didn't want to right up to the last. And then," said Walter, determined to make a clean breast of it, "I liked it while I was at it." The Reverend John's eyes twinkled. "You were a little frightened at first?" "I was a whole lot frightened," said honest Walter. "But I'm not going to be frightened any more, sir. Being frightened of things is worse than the things themselves. I'm going to ask my father to take me over to Lowbridge tomorrow to get my tooth out." "Right again. Fear is more pain than is the pain it fears. Do you know who wrote that, Walter? It was Shakespeare. Was there any feeling or emotion or experience of the human heart that wonderful man did not know? When you go home, tell your mother I am proud of you." Walter did not tell her that, however, but he told her all the rest, and she sympathized with him and told him she was glad he had stood up for her and Faith, and she anointed his sore spots and rubbed cologne on his aching head. "Are all mothers as nice as you?" asked Walter, hugging her. "You're worth standing up for." Miss Cornelia and Susan were in the living room when Anne came downstairs, and listened to the story with much enjoyment. Susan in particular was highly gratified. "I am real glad to hear he has had a good fight, Mrs. Doctor dear. Perhaps it may knock that poetry nonsense out of him. And I never could bear that little viper of a Dan Reese. Will you not sit nearer to the fire, Mrs. Marshall Elliott? These November evenings are very chilly." "Thank you, Susan. I'm not cold. I called at the manse before I came here, and got quite warm, though I had to go to the kitchen to do it, for there was no fire anywhere else." "The kitchen looked as if it had been stirred up with a stick, believe me. Mr. Meredith wasn't home. I couldn't find out where he was, but I have an idea he was up at the Wests. Do you know, Anne dearie, they say he has been going there frequently all the fall, and people are beginning to think he is going to see Rosemary." "He would get a very charming wife if he married Rosemary," said Anne, piling driftwood on the fire. "She is one of the most delightful girls I've ever known. Truly one of the race of Joseph." "Yes, only she is an Episcopalian," said Miss Cornelia doubtfully. "Of course, that is better than if she was a Methodist. But I do think Mr. Meredith could find a good enough wife in his own denomination. However, very likely there is nothing in it. It's only a month ago that I said to him, 'You ought to marry again, Mr. Meredith.' He looked as shocked as if I had suggested something improper. 'My wife is in her grave, Mrs. Elliott,' he said, in that gentle, saintly way of his. 'I suppose so,' I said, 'or I wouldn't be advising you to marry again.' Then he looked more shocked than ever. So I doubt if there is much in this Rosemary story. If a single minister calls twice at a house where there is a single woman, all the gossips have it he is courting her." "It seems to me, if I may presume to say so, that Mr. Meredith is too shy to go courting a second wife," said Susan solemnly. "He isn't shy, believe me," retorted Miss Cornelia. "Absent-minded, yes, but shy, no. And for all he is so abstracted and dreamy, he has a very good opinion of himself, manlike, and when he is really awake, he wouldn't think it much of a chore to ask any woman to have him. No, the trouble is, he's deluding himself into believing that his heart is buried, while all the time it's beating away inside of him, just like anybody else's. He may have a notion of Rosemary West, and he may not. If he has, We must make the best of it. She is a sweet girl and a fine housekeeper, and would make a good mother for those poor neglected children. And," concluded Miss Cornelia resignedly, "my own grandmother was an Episcopalian." Chapter 17. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 18. Mary brings evil tidings. Mary Vance, whom Mrs. Elliott had sent up to the manse on an errand, came tripping down Rainbow Valley on her way to Ingleside, where she was to spend the afternoon with Nan and Di as a Saturday treat. Nan and Di had been picking spruce gum with Faith and Una in the manse woods, and the four of them were now sitting on a fallen pine by the brook, all, it must be admitted, chewing rather vigorously. The Ingleside twins were not allowed to chew spruce gum anywhere but in the seclusion of Rainbow Valley, but Faith and Una were quite unrestricted by such rules of etiquette, and cheerfully chewed it everywhere, at home and abroad, to the very proper horror of the Glen. Faith had been seen chewing it in church one day, but Jerry had realized the enormity of that, and had given her such an older brotherly scolding that she never did it again. "I was so hungry I just felt as if I had to chew something," she protested. "You know well enough what breakfast was like, Jerry Meredith. I couldn't eat scorched porridge, and my stomach just felt so queer and empty. The gum helped a lot, and I didn't chew very hard. I didn't make any noise, and I never cracked the gum once." "You mustn't chew gum in church anyhow," insisted Jerry. "Don't let me catch you at it again." "You chewed yourself in prayer meeting last week," cried Faith. "That's different," said Jerry loftily. "Prayer meeting isn't on Sunday. Besides, I sat away at the back in a dark seat, and nobody saw me. You were sitting right up in front, where everyone saw you. And I took the gum out of my mouth for the last hymn, and stuck it on the back of the pew in front of me. Then I came away and forgot it. I went back to get it next morning, but it was gone. I suppose Rod Warren swiped it, and it was a dandy chew." Mary Vance walked down the valley with her head held high. She had on a new blue velvet cap with a scarlet rosette in it, a coat of navy blue cloth, and a little squirrel fur muff. She was very conscious of her new clothes, and very well pleased with herself. Her hair was elaborately crimped, her face was quite plump, her cheeks rosy, her white eyes shining. She did not look much like the forlorn and ragged waif the Merediths had found in the old Taylor barn. Una tried not to feel envious. Here was Mary with a new velvet cap, but she and Faith had to wear their shabby old grey tams again this winter. Nobody ever thought of getting them new ones, and they were afraid to ask their father for them, for fear that he might be short of money, and then he would feel badly. Mary had told them once that ministers were always short of money, and found it awful hard to make ends meet. Since then, Faith and Una would have gone in rags rather than ask their father for anything if they could help it. They did not worry a great deal over their shabbiness, but it was rather trying to see Mary Vance coming out in such style, and putting on such airs about it too. The new squirrel muff was really the last straw. Neither Faith nor Una had ever had a muff, counting themselves lucky if they could compass mittens without holes in them. Aunt Martha could not see to darn holes, and though Una tried to, she made sad cobbling. Somehow they could not make their greeting of Mary very cordial. But Mary did not mind or notice that. She was not overly sensitive. She vaulted lightly to a seat on the pine tree, and laid the offending muff on a bough. Una saw that it was lined with shirred red satin, and had red tassels. She looked down at her own rather purple, chapped little hands, and wondered if she would ever, ever be able to put them into a muff like that. "Give us a chew," said Mary companionably. Nan, Di, and Faith all produced an amber-hued knot or two from their pockets and passed them to Mary. Una sat very still. She had 4 lovely big knots in the pocket of her tight, threadbare little jacket, but she wasn't going to give one of them to Mary Vance. Not one. Let Mary pick her own gum. People with squirrel muffs needn't expect to get everything in the world. "Great day, isn't it?" said Mary, swinging her legs, the better, perhaps, to display new boots with very smart cloth tops. Una tucked her feet under her. There was a hole in the toe of one of her boots, and both laces were much knotted. But they were the best she had. Oh, this Mary Vance! Why hadn't they left her in the old barn? Una never felt badly because the Ingleside twins were better dressed than she and Faith were. They wore their pretty clothes with careless grace, and never seemed to think about them at all. Somehow they did not make other people feel shabby. But when Mary Vance was dressed up, she seemed fairly to exude clothes, to walk in an atmosphere of clothes, to make everybody else feel and think clothes. Una, as she sat there in the honey-tinted sunshine of the gracious December afternoon, was acutely and miserably conscious of everything she had on: the faded tam, which was yet her best, the skimpy jacket she had worn for 3 winters, the holes in her skirt and her boots, the shivering insufficiency of her poor little undergarments. Of course, Mary was going out for a visit, and she was not. But even if she had been, she had nothing better to put on, and in this lay the sting. "Say, this is great gum. Listen to me cracking it. There ain't any gum spruces down at Four Winds," said Mary. "Sometimes I just hanker after a chew. Mrs. Elliott won't let me chew gum if she sees me. She says it ain't ladylike. This lady business puzzles me. I can't get on to all its kinks. Say, Una, what's the matter with you? Cat got your tongue?" "No," said Una, who could not drag her fascinated eyes from that squirrel muff. Mary leaned past her, picked it up, and thrust it into Una's hands. "Stick your paws in that for a while," she ordered. "They look sorter pinched. Ain't that a dandy muff? Mrs. Elliott give it to me last week for a birthday present. I'm to get the collar at Christmas. I heard her telling Mr. Elliott that." "Mrs. Elliott is very good to you," said Faith. "You bet she is. And I'm good to her, too," retorted Mary. "I work like a nigger to make it easy for her, and have everything just as she likes it. We was made for each other. 'Tisn't every one could get along with her as well as I do. She's pizen neat, but so am I, and so we agree fine." "I told you she would never whip you." "So you did. She's never tried to lay a finger on me, and I ain't never told a lie to her. Not one, true as you live. She combs me down with her tongue sometimes, though, but that just slips off me like water off a duck's back. Say, Una, why didn't you hang on to the muff?" Una had put it back on the bough. "My hands aren't cold, thank you," she said stiffly. "Well, if you're satisfied, I am. Say, old Kitty Alec has come back to church as meek as Moses, and nobody knows why. But everybody is saying it was Faith brought Norman Douglas out. His housekeeper says you went there and gave him an awful tongue-lashing. Did you?" "I went and asked him to come to church," said Faith uncomfortably. "Fancy your spunk!" said Mary admiringly. "I wouldn't have dared to do that, and I'm not so slow. Mrs. Wilson says the 2 of you jawed something scandalous, but you come off best, and then he just turned round and liked to eat you up. Say, is your father going to preach here tomorrow?" "No. He is going to exchange with Mr. Perry from Charlottetown. Father went to town this morning, and Mr. Perry is coming out tonight. I thought there was something in the wind, though old Martha wouldn't give me any satisfaction. But I felt sure she wouldn't have been killing that rooster for nothing." "What rooster? What do you mean?" cried Faith, turning pale. "I don't know what rooster. I didn't see it. When she took the butter Mrs. Elliott sent up, she said she'd been out to the barn killing a rooster for dinner tomorrow." Faith sprang down from the pine. "It's Adam. We have no other rooster. She has killed Adam. Now don't fly off the handle. Martha said the butcher at the Glen had no meat this week, and she had to have something, and the hens were all laying, and too poor. If she has killed Adam—" Faith began to run up the hill. Mary shrugged her shoulders. "She'll go crazy now. She was so fond of that Adam. He ought to have been in the pot long ago. He'll be as tough as sole leather. But I wouldn't like to be in Martha's shoes. Faith's just white with rage. Una, you'd better go after her, and try to pacify her." Mary had gone a few steps with the Blythe girls when Una suddenly turned and ran after her. "Here's some gum for you, Mary," she said, with a little repentant catch in her voice, thrusting all her 4 knots into Mary's hands. "And I'm glad you have such a pretty muff." "Why, thanks," said Mary, rather taken by surprise. To the Blythe girls, after Una had gone, she said, "Ain't she a queer little mite? But I've always said she had a good heart." End of chapter 18. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 19. Poor Adam. When Una got home, Faith was lying face downwards on her bed, utterly refusing to be comforted. Aunt Martha had killed Adam. He was reposing on a platter in the pantry that very minute, trussed and dressed, encircled by his liver and heart and gizzard. Aunt Martha heeded Faith's passion of grief and anger not a whit. "We had to have something for the strange minister's dinner," she said. "You're too big a girl to make such a fuss over an old rooster. You knew he'd have to be killed sometime." "I'll tell father when he comes home what you've done," sobbed Faith. "Don't you go bothering your poor father. He has troubles enough, and I'm housekeeper here." "Adam was mine! Mrs. Johnson gave him to me. You had no business to touch him," stormed Faith. "Don't you get sassy now. The rooster's killed, and there's an end of it. I ain't going to set no strange minister down to a dinner of cold boiled mutton. I was brought up to know better than that, if I have come down in the world." Faith would not go down to supper that night, and she would not go to church the next morning. But at dinner time she went to the table, her eyes swollen with crying, her face sullen. The Reverend James Perry was a sleek, rubicund man, with a bristling white moustache, bushy white eyebrows, and a shining bald head. He was certainly not handsome, and he was a very tiresome, pompous sort of person. But if he had looked like the archangel Michael and talked with the tongues of men and angels, Faith would still have utterly detested him. He carved Adam up dexterously, showing off his plump white hands and a very handsome diamond ring. Also, he made jovial remarks all through the performance. Jerry and Carl giggled, and even Una smiled wanly, because she thought politeness demanded it, but Faith only scowled darkly. The Reverend James thought her manners shockingly bad. Once, when he was delivering himself of an unctuous remark to Jerry, Faith broke in rudely with a flat contradiction. The Reverend James drew his bushy eyebrows together at her. "Little girls should not interrupt," he said, "and they should not contradict people who know far more than they do." This put Faith in a worse temper than ever. To be called "little girl," as if she were no bigger than chubby Rilla Blythe over at Ingleside. It was insufferable. And how that abominable Mr. Perry did eat! He even picked poor Adam's bones. Neither Faith nor Una would touch a mouthful, and looked upon the boys as little better than cannibals. Faith felt that if that awful repast did not soon come to an end, she would wind up by throwing something at Mr. Perry's gleaming head. Fortunately, Mr. Perry found Aunt Martha's leathery apple pie too much even for his powers of mastication, and the meal came to an end, after a long grace, in which Mr. Perry offered up devout thanks for the food which a kind and beneficent Providence had provided for sustenance and temperate pleasure. "God hadn't a single thing to do with providing Adam for you," muttered Faith rebelliously under her breath. The boys gladly made their escape to outdoors. Una went to help Aunt Martha with the dishes, though that rather grumpy old dame never welcomed her timid assistance, and Faith betook herself to the study, where a cheerful wood fire was burning in the grate. She thought she would thereby escape from the hated Mr. Perry, who had announced his intention of taking a nap in his room during the afternoon. But scarcely had Faith settled herself in a corner with a book, when he walked in, and standing before the fire, proceeded to survey the disorderly study with an air of disapproval. "Your father's books seem to be in somewhat deplorable confusion, my little girl," he said severely. Faith darkled in her corner, and said not a word. She would not talk to this creature. "You should try to put them in order," Mr. Perry went on, playing with his handsome watch chain, and smiling patronizingly on Faith. "You are quite old enough to attend to such duties. My little daughter at home is only 10, and she is already an excellent little housekeeper, and the greatest help and comfort to her mother. She was a very sweet child. I wish you had the privilege of her acquaintance. She could help you in many ways. Of course, you have not had the inestimable privilege of a good mother's care and training. A sad lack, a very sad lack. I have spoken more than once to your father in this connection, and pointed out his duty to him faithfully, but so far with no effect. I trust he may awaken to a realization of his responsibility before it is too late. In the meantime, it is your duty and privilege to endeavour to take your sainted mother's place. You might exercise a great influence over your brothers and your little sister. You might be a true mother to them. I fear that you do not think of these things as you should. My dear child, allow me to open your eyes in regard to them." Mr. Perry's oily, complacent voice trickled on. He was in his element. Nothing suited him better than to lay down the law, patronize, and exhort. He had no idea of stopping, and he did not stop. He stood before the fire, his feet planted firmly on the rug, and poured out a flood of pompous platitudes. Faith heard not a word. She was really not listening to him at all, but she was watching his long black coat-tails with impish delight growing in her brown eyes. Mr. Perry was standing very near the fire. His coat-tails began to scorch. His coat-tails began to smoke. He still prosed on, wrapped up in his own eloquence. The coat-tails smoked worse. A tiny spark flew up from the burning wood, and alighted in the middle of one. It clung and caught, and spread into a smouldering flame. Faith could restrain herself no longer, and broke into a stifled giggle. Mr. Perry stopped short, angered over this impertinence. Suddenly he became conscious that a reek of burning cloth filled the room. He whirled round and saw nothing. Then he clapped his hands to his coat-tails and brought them around in front of him. There was already quite a hole in one of them, and this was his new suit. Faith shook with helpless laughter over his pose and expression. "Did you see my coat-tails burning?" he demanded angrily. "Yes, sir," said Faith demurely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, glaring at her. "You said it wasn't good manners to interrupt, sir," said Faith, more demurely still. If I was your father, I would give you a spanking that you would remember all your life, miss," said a very angry reverend gentleman, as he stalked out of the study. The coat of Mr. Meredith's second-best suit would not fit Mr. Perry, so he had to go to the evening service with his singed coat-tail. But he did not walk up the aisle with his usual consciousness of the honour he was conferring on the building. He never would agree to an exchange of pulpits with Mr. Meredith again, and he was barely civil to the latter when they met for a few minutes at the station the next morning. But Faith felt a certain gloomy satisfaction. Adam was partially avenged. End of chapter 19.